All right. So we have people that have joined in, and we have folks, I think, ready to start. So I'm going to do that. This is Karen Billings, and I'm with the Software and Information Industry Association, Vice President of the Education Division. And I'd like to welcome you to our webcast today called the EdTech Opportunities in Africa. And we'll talk a little bit more about the working group that has created this. But I do want to make a few SIA announcements before we get into the actual topic for today. Number one is that we have now finished the industry market report, the sales revenue report from our PK-12 members of the community. And we have a report. It's available in the eStore, just siia.net/eStore, as well as another product that is absolutely free to members, and that's called Social Media Marketing in Education. So if you haven't downloaded that, you should, because I think that'll be worthwhile. It's from a survey that we did about how our companies are using social media marketing. The EdTech Government Forum, our yearly, what we used to call DC Fly-In, is scheduled for March 7th and 8th here in Washington, D.C. So watch for a save the date and further information about registering and sponsoring from a lot of us in the, in the community here. The EdTech Industry Summit is going to be May 6th through 8th in San Francisco. And this is a yearly conference. We have our Innovation Incubator programs. We also have our Coady Awards and Gala on that Monday night, May 7th. I have a special request, and that is if any of you know of educators who would make good judges for a couple of categories, primarily the enterprise categories, please email me, because we still need some for some of those categories. We have more nominations than we expected, and we need more judges as a result. We also are taking planning committee members for the EdTech Industry Summit, so please email me, kbillings@siia.net, if you would like to be on the planning committee for that. That's for members, of course. A couple of other things now that we have more people on the call. The webcast that you're listening to is being recorded. We will be able to take the audio file and some additional information, slide presentations, and make them available on our Ed Division homepage. When you go to siia.net/education, you will see on the left-hand side that little icon which says EdTech Webcasts. And when you click on that, you'll see a list of webcasts that you can, as a member, access, and you can listen to any already archived webcast. The best way to ask questions today is through the chat feature. It's on the lower left corner of your screen, and you should be able to select the people that you want to ask the question of. You can broadcast it to all. You can ask it of a certain person, and you can, of course, ask it to the co-presenters. So without taking any more time for just SIIA, I'm going to turn it over to Mimi Jett, who is chair of the Global Working Group who planned this particular webcast. And I would also like to welcome, we have presenters from Salt Lake, from Indianapolis, from New Jersey, from San Diego, and a couple of us in rainy D.C. So I'm pleased that everything is working, and I look forward to hearing a great webcast from the Global Working Group. Mimi, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you, Karen. Welcome, everyone. We are so pleased to have you here today. The Global Strategies Working Group under SIIA is a group of people that are all members of SIIA that contribute greatly throughout the year to help other members understand what the global opportunities are. We've been an active group now for 2 years, and in that time we've held several webcasts. This year alone, we've done webcasts on the Middle East, on Asia. Today we're discussing Africa, and then in January you can look forward to a webcast on Latin America. One of the things that we do a lot is to reach out to other countries and invite their participants in educational technologies to interact with us, to partner with our members. And whether we're doing exporting or importing, global alliances are very important to this group. So I would invite you all to join our group. You can see Karen's contact information at the bottom of the screen. It is an active group. As I said, we meet once a month. So without further ado, I would like to, first I want to mention our upcoming trade mission to BET in London. This is a huge show that has people participating from all over the world. It's a very international conference on educational technologies. The SIA will be holding a EdTech Pavilion for U.S. members. So this is a great opportunity to participate in a very active show and get discounted prices as well. The prices for participating are much lower than if you were to get a stand yourself. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Kelly Hamilton. I've known Kelly for many years and have been honored to work with her. Kelly is part of our Global Strategies Working Group and is our moderator today. Kelly?
Great. Thank you, Mimi. As Mimi said, my name is Kelly Hamilton. I work at Blackboard, and I am thrilled to be here today moderating this session with our presenters, Jim Teicher, Mike Tricano, and Charles Callis. And so at this time, I'm just going to take a few moments to let each of them introduce themselves, and then we'll get into the content of the discussion. So Jim?
Sure. Thanks, Kelly. This is Jim Teicher, and actually I married my own personal volunteer efforts in school improvement in West Africa with my work in the U.S., where CyberSmart has been providing online professional development and curriculum in 21st century skills. Simply observed a big problem in Africa, that a dominant approach to develop scale with EdTech, namely computer rooms and laptops, are extremely challenged. So my work focuses on an alternative complementary approach using a specially adapted interactive whiteboard. Thanks.
And Charles.
Thanks, Kelly. I'm Charles Callis. I'm Vice President of International Development for the Waterford Research Institute. We're a nonprofit organization focused on developing personalized learning software in literacy, numeracy, and science. I've been doing business development for software organizations ranging from startup to very large companies globally for more years than I care to remember. And I'm happy to have the opportunity to be with you today. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you, Charles. And Mike.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, everyone. I'm Mike Tricano. I work at the World Bank. For the many American companies don't know what the bank is. We are essentially the investment arm of the United Nations system. We provide in the education sector about $2 to $3 billion worth of developmental assistance every year to countries around the world, low and middle income countries. Increasingly, we are doing it to help countries as they explore how to use educational technologies in various ways, including in Africa. And I'm the guy who is responsible for, I'm the EdTech specialist here, I guess you would say.
Great. Thank you, Mike. So as you can see, we've got a panel of experts here to talk to us today about Africa. And we're going to get a little bit of background information in a moment. But first, we wanted to start with some general questions so that it'll help set the context for some of the background that Jim is going to provide. So we're going to talk a little bit about what the landscape looks like in Africa with the many nations and many people. Is it appropriate to generalize? We're going to talk about some of the challenges associated with working in Africa. And we're also going to talk about how our panelists have experienced success in building relationships and partnerships in Africa. So with those questions in mind, we'll come back to those for discussion. But first, I'm going to let Jim provide us a little bit of background.
Sure. Thanks, Kelly. I've observed several data points which really are converging together, which begin to paint a picture of the environment in Africa in which EdTech is evolving. These are just a few highlights. There are many others. First of all, when I speak about, I think when we speak about Africa here, I largely mean, and I'm talking about sub-Saharan Africa, which is essentially all the nations below the Sahara Desert, whereas Northern Africa is traditionally associated with the Arab world. So I just wanted to clarify that. The biggest thing we see here is a growing youth bubble. And that's very significant. Ages 10 to 14 will grow faster than any other region on Earth. I think that's really a critical factor compared to China, which will actually have a growth slump, and even compared to India. This youth bubble is just growing faster than in any other region of the world. The next slide, Kelly. Couple this with increasing school enrollment. And I want to point out here the data point for the change in primary school enrollment for sub-Saharan Africa. And this is really mostly due, I believe, to African nations' commitment to the Millennium Development Goals of universal primary education by 2015. This goal won't be realized, but actually it's resulted in a surge of school enrollment. By the way, these Millennium Development Goals are essentially a United Nations, you could call it blueprint for development that was committed to by African leaders. For the next chart, looking at internet use there on top, you see we have small penetration, but lots of growth, more growth than anywhere on the planet. And when you couple that with decreasing telecommunications costs and a desire really for all these nations to ultimately benefit economically through globalization, it paints an interesting picture for ed tech looking forward. But the big snag comes in the next slide, electrification. That nearly 80% of sub-Saharan Africa lacks electricity, and that most all of sub-Saharan Africa has unreliable power. And of course, most educational technologies require power. So this is a challenge that must be addressed. So I really see the current environment for ed tech better than ever before because of the advancements in computing, price decreases, power technologies, but still the challenge really is to focus these innovations on learning improvements, not just supplying equipment and solar panels, but real impact on learning. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Jim, for that background. Sure. So now we'll move into the questions, and we'll open this up for any of the speakers to respond. But from your experiences in Africa, what's the landscape look like for growth for educational technologies in Africa, and is it appropriate to generalize when we're talking about the current environment there?
Okay, so who should take this?
Anyone who would like.
Mike?
Sure. So I'll jump in. This is Mike. So is it appropriate to generalize? Certainly not, but I think certainly in business that's what we need to do to figure out what markets, and there are numerous different markets I think that we're talking about here in Africa, from North Africa, which are relatively established, South Africa, which is a huge outlier, and then a number of very fast-growing countries with huge surging middle classes who are very interested in investing in education, like Nigeria, like Kenya, like Tanzania, like Namibia, like Ghana. I think there is a lot to be excited about. That said, I think we've been on a slow simmer for a long time in Africa. I've been working for about the last 14 years in educational technology there, and I don't think we're yet at an inflection point, but we're seeing with the growth of the middle class, with lots more kids going to school, as Jim outlined, and with very strong aspirations about what's important to invest in and investing in children and their education. I think there's a lot of appetite if people have the right products and services. There's a lot of appetite to buy products and services related to ICTs in education, as most people refer to it there. There's also a tremendous amount of bandwidth going into the continent very quickly, whereas a lot of the country has been not lit up with much fiber. That is changing very, very quickly, and we'll continue to see huge growth in basic connectivity, like we saw with growth in mobile phones over the last 10 years. We're about ready to see that in the internet space as well.
And Charles or Jim, would you say that you have experienced a similar environment as what Mike described?
Charles? Well, this is Jim. I think that just to drill down a little bit deeper here, other challenges, aside from dealing with the opportunity, but real challenges. Of course, we work with governments and sources of funding which aren't and needed to be prodded to work at the pace of innovation that we would like. Also, logistics in Africa are difficult. Managing distribution, training, ongoing support with poor infrastructure really, to me, prompts me to try to keep it as simple as possible. I see so many programs just bogged down in their own organizational issues that the whole reason why they're doing what they're doing seems to be lost.
Great. Thank you, Jim.
This is Charles. I agree with what has already been said. We look at Africa in a very similar light as what I think Jim does. Africa and Asia will constitute about 80% of the world's primary school-age population soon, and of that 80%, Africa is about a third. And so for an organization that has traditionally focused on North American markets, teaching literacy, numeracy, and science to primary school-age children, this represents not only an opportunity but a mandate for us to begin to switch focus. And so we're taking a long-term look at Africa and Asia, and it is specifically in Africa because of the gap that is so enormous between educational needs and available resources that ICT represents a real opportunity for Africa to leapfrog what has been a stagnant educational system for the last millennium in the West. And so with the numbers of children, with the needs aligned to what ICT can bring to education, and with a real orientation toward education being taken not only by traditional NGOs and governments, but by commercial organizations as well. And you couple that with several things that are happening, as Mike and Jim alluded to, with the near-term explosion in bandwidth we'll see as a result of the submarine cable systems around Africa, with the reduction in cost or price of electrification technologies, the very cheap photovoltaic cells and other technologies, and with the reduction in price of hardware, all things seem to be coming aligned for ICT-based education to really take off in the next few years.
Yeah, this is Jim. I think also we're all looking for that perfect storm situation. When does everything converge so that there's opportunity to leverage technologies for many of these nations? We see the bandwidth improving. We see the costs coming down. We see a lot of equipment improvements and power improvements, and all of this is coming together. And just putting those pieces together with the right timing and aligning everything is sort of the age-old challenge, I think, whether it's this Africa or anywhere else.
And when we talk about all of these things coming together, when it's the right time for a company to make a move in Africa, from your experience, how best can they organize to build relationships and partnerships?
Well, this is Jim again. Well, to us, being a small organization, we first of all latched onto a big challenge, and it's important to have obviously a major problem you're addressing. and then obviously marrying that to your value added. So finding out who the players are, just doing the research. We chose just to dig in, and you could say call it learning by doing, which is another important part of the process, that you're actually in there doing something. So we sought out schools. We sought aggressively, built a relationship with USAID, started to do a little work on our own, and then invited the USAID people to watch it and observe, and others, and just slowly over several years built a network based on others observing our work and how it matched with the need.
Thanks, Jim. And Charles or Mike, could you respond to how to build partnerships in Africa?
Sure. This is Mike. I think being there is, of course, the most important, and figuring out where you can be first to give you the greatest chance of bumping into the types of people and organizations and companies that might be useful to you. There are a number of, like eLearning Africa, and I probably every other week get a notice about some large event in Africa to bring together vendors and to bring together government folks, and government is an incredibly important, let's say, buyer of goods and services in this regard, to a much greater extent perhaps in other regions of the world. And I think a low-cost way to nose around a little bit would be to consider sending someone to just go and listen and learn and see who else shows up. Shows like BET that were mentioned at the start of this call, which is in the UK, but we take whole sets of African ministers of education to there every year, and there are ways to, even if you're not on the ground yet, to go to some of these international events to at least give you a sense of where you might want to point yourself.
And Mike, I think that leads into one of the questions in the chat window. If you're looking to go to a particular area to one of these events, or to look at starting the business in Africa, is there an area outside of North African countries and South Africa? Is there an area in the sub-Saharan region that's leading the way in what you're seeing happen in Africa?
Well, certainly one in every 4 Africans is Nigerian. So the Nigerian market is potentially just massive, and they have a lot of challenges there, but they have also a natural resource boom that is causing some parts of the population to see some substantial increases in their incomes. For most American firms, they find language a challenge. So going to places like Ghana is a popular place, or Kenya, Tanzania, larger countries where there is a great deal of international business being done already. Those are sort of gateway countries. For non-English speaking countries, Senegal is certainly, I guess, a leading a country in this regard, French speaking, but that is another country that jumps to mind immediately.
Thank you. And Charles, I want to come back to you. Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, Kelly. Thank you.
No, that's okay.
I think there are a lot of places to start. I think being on the ground as early as possible is necessary, and I think shows like eLearning Africa are a pretty good place to start with that. But I think a lot of preliminary work can be done. One of the challenges of ICT-based education and how to pursue markets in Africa is the very fact that there are so many different stakeholders in education and ICT in education in Africa. There are funds coming from a number of different sources, including from national governments, and it can get quite complex to navigate those waters. But I think that once you've done a little bit of homework on what countries are interesting for you, most of the embassies of those countries in Washington, D.C. are very open to having conversations with software developers and technology companies about what they might be able to provide in terms of educational solutions in their particular country. There are organizations in the U.S. like the East Africa Chamber of Commerce. I went to a meeting of that organization in Dallas just a couple of months ago. Great way to meet ministerial level officials and ambassadors and commerce officials associated with those countries and those markets for educational products. I think that there are a lot of global players who are very interested in outcomes in Africa with respect to establishing ICT as an increasingly important part of the educational solution mix. Organizations like Intel and Microsoft and Cisco and Google all have global educational development organizations, and some of them have programs that are open to technology companies, and those can be extremely useful in getting introductions to potential partners in target countries as well. So I think there are things that can be done here. I think that there are things that can be done regionally. The UN has at least one or two organizations devoted to ICT and education that are very open to engaging organizations and companies in discussions. But ultimately, at the end of the day, somebody needs to go there and be on the ground to learn what's really going on and to learn who the critical stakeholders are.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. We've done the conferences, speaking at conferences, building. Oh gosh, in Washington, for example, I built a relationship with the Senegalese ambassador to the United States, and then in Dakar, have met several times with the American ambassador to Senegal. There's a Senegalese America Association. There are all sorts of groups, newsletters, conferences, Mike's blog, and the World Bank data and UNESCO information. So we really try to leverage everything we can. I think also in terms of relationships, there are a lot of projects going, but have to think about, well, if you're really in there to build something for the long term, for the long haul, because there are so many short-lived projects, and that has a lot to do with who you ally with and what you do. Are you with a partner which is really in it for scale for the long haul? And that's an important question that we just continually to focus on.
And Kelly, may I just follow up? I agree. To expand on what Jim just said, which I think was excellent, and I agree with everything Charles said as well. I talk to lots of companies, and I tell them, you may get that first sale, and it may come quickly in some circumstances, but your second one, people are going to be paying a lot of attention. It can be a lot easier to get that first one than the second one, and people are really, really cost conscious. And if you come in and you think you're successful because you've done one thing initially, a lot of these things do die out, or they have a very short lifespan. And if you want to be in there for the long run, it's useful to think long run from the very start.
Yeah, I mean, you can make anything look good for a model poster project in Africa, with enough money and et cetera. You can make anything fly, but that's really different than building scale for the long term, really different. And we tend mostly to hear of the projects that are the poster projects, honestly.
Well, and so what you gentlemen are discussing, I think, is a great segue to this next question for Mike, and that is, sometimes things don't always go well. There is sometimes failure, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. So what are some of the other mistakes that you've seen ed tech companies make when they try to move into Africa?
So thanks, Kelly. I think the biggest mistake without fail is simply looking to export a solution to a place and expecting it to work just like it works at home. This may be just common sense. And related to that is to assume that because something works, if you've tested it out in, let's say, relatively affluent schools in an urban area, and with relatively, stress that word here, that it'll work everywhere else across the country, because there are huge disparities in income and in context in urban centers from what we see in rural areas. And about 4 years ago, I was involved in evaluating a project where about 50 companies from around the world came to Africa under something called the NAPAD eSchools Initiative and tried to put together showcase pilots as a way to demonstrate to governments what they could do. And the project failed in many ways, I think, because they really treated their initial investments as showcases and as showcasing what they were able to do and what they did, let's say, back home, and not taking into account the real on-the-ground context. And very, very few of those things went anywhere.
Great. And then to contrast that then, based on what you've seen, both good and bad, why should we be excited about Africa?
Well, I think we've heard some of the stats from both Jim and Charles about what will be huge growing cohorts of young people. If you're looking to grow somewhere, the markets in Europe and the States and places like Korea, Japan, Australia, they'll grow, but they certainly don't have the potential to grow like they will in Africa. And Africa has very specific needs in the education sector that just aren't being met by traditional means. And if we're talking about non-traditional approaches to providing services related to education, it's hard to see how technology will not be an important component of those solutions. And even where there is free education, as there is meant to be on paper throughout most of Africa, we do see that as a practical matter, many families are paying and paying quite a bit, whether these are informal payments to schools or because they send their children to the growing numbers of private schools across maybe very, very low-cost private schools. There is an appetite for this stuff, and there are strong aspirations to have children do better than their parents, as there are in the rest of the world. But the percentage of money spent on education throughout most African economies compared to what we see in OECD countries is different in many cases by an order of magnitude. So I think there's an appetite there.
Great, thank you. So Charles, then moving on to your question, in your experiences, what particular business models do you think work in order to sell into Africa? And we've talked about several different countries. Do you think that we need to think about different business models for those different countries?
Great, Kelly. Yes. I think that in general there is a business model that works, although nothing is certain anywhere, and Africa brings a lot of new twists and wrinkles to any model. But you can't think of a kind of Pan-African market or even regional markets really. I think that regional opportunities will eventually emerge, but today, and at least for the last 25 years, my experience has been that you really have to look at Africa on a case-by-case, country-by-country, market-by-market basis. Now, having said that, I think the one business model that really makes sense in Africa is that of a leveraged business model, where you're leveraging the capabilities, resources, connections of other organizations who are already in the ground in individual markets. And so I'd say leverage is really the core business model that works. Partnerships are a must in African countries. In general, I think to be successful in advancing ICT-based education, solutions, products, technologies within African countries, there are three general sets of relationships that you have to cultivate. One is the bilateral, multilateral donor / non-governmental organization communities. And there are a set of usual suspects in that regard that operate in most of the countries, but the mix from one country to another can be quite different. But they provide a lot of the professional expertise as well as the funding that goes into implementing ICT-based educational projects. The second set of relationships that is absolutely critical are relationships with local and national government in each of these countries. And the Ministries of Education play an absolutely critical role in determining how ICT-based solutions will ultimately be deployed in these countries. And the third set of relationships that's absolutely critical are the commercial relationships. And that means that there needs to be somebody in the market who can supply hardware, software, and other technologies that can provide ongoing warranty support, technical support, curricular support, provide ongoing training. And there are some potentially, and this will vary country by country, there are potentially different types of commercial relationships that might be relevant. It could be a value-added educational reseller, for example. Or in another country, a wireless carrier might actually be the primary commercial partner of interest. At any point, you've got to have all three. You've got to have the donor NGO community lined up, you've got to have government relationships lined up, and you've got to have commercial relationships lined up. And all three of those will lead to the ability to scale within the country and will lead to longer-term staying power within the country. So in that sense, that general model, I think, applies. How you achieve that can vary significantly from one organization to another and from country to country. But in my experience, this sort of tripartite partnership concept hasn't changed a lot in the last 20 years. And like I said, I think regional communities will begin to emerge that allow you to address multiple smaller markets in a more economically efficient manner. For example, the East African community consisting of Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi are beginning to plan together with respect to educational issues and ICT in education. And I think in the long run there will be regional communities that develop that are coordinating their approach and their activities that will give vendors from other parts of the world, again, a more scalable approach to doing business in Africa. But today, it's definitely country by country. Now, I think there are a couple of key things that you need to consider as you go in. And one is you need to be flexible. Circumstances will change, as I've said, quite a lot country by country. And there will be a unique set of partnership requirements country by country. The economics, infrastructural, commercial, and political risk will be different from one country to another, and you will need to make your own choices about what is acceptable risk and what is acceptable opportunity. But there are a lot of resources available that I'd be happy to follow up with anybody on to help you make those kinds of decisions. And then each country is quite different in the educational environment with respect to its structure. So for example, in Rwanda, a very small proportion of schools are private schools, whereas in Ghana, 40% of the primary schools are private schools. And so that in and of itself gives you different opportunities and requirements with respect to market development. Kelly, I'm going on and on, so you better cut me off.
No, that's great, Charles. Thank you very much. And I think in your description of the different relationships that are important, I think you implied a bit about thought leadership. And so, Steve, we'll come back to your question. I'm going to give Jim a chance to answer his questions, and then I'll pose your question for the group to respond to. So, Jim.
Thanks. From I think what everybody hears, for all of us, it's been a lot of proactive work, a lot of thought leadership, but mostly becoming established in anything new, particularly in other cultures and other continents, is something that takes time. But my I guess my story of becoming established really takes a little bit more of a personal path, coming out of several years of voluntary work in school improvement on a pretty basic level in terms of roofs, food, books, and began to apply my knowledge of ed tech in the U.S. and just observe, and saw that perhaps there's another way where we can scale technology into schools to be more part of everyday learning for more schools. Kelly, why don't you go to the next slide here, number 20. Our approach was simply to take a whole class approach where we'd focus on teacher training, and you can see from the picture on the left that there are holes in the roofs. And this is typical for a classroom. In fact, this is better than most. So you're dealing with lack of security. You're dealing oftentimes with lack of power. Even if the school has power, you're challenged to that there might be not power. There might not be power in classrooms, but there might be power in the office, and then power cuts on and off. So we worked over time to refine and build an adapted whiteboard with a whole training process where we're focusing more on learner-centered professional development than equipment per se, and reaching out to schools off the grid with low-cost solar power. And as it built, then started to build relationships to show USAID, for example, what we've been doing. Invited them out to our site and built relationships to the point where we ended up getting a U.S. government contract this past year. I think also finding and asking experts and seeking their advice, getting a local team in place, that we found to be extremely valuable. So that's really the process, and for us and for me, it's been a path of about 5 years.
Great, thanks, Jim. So we've got a little bit of time left for Q&A, so if you do have questions, I encourage you to enter them into the chat window. But I wanted to go back to Steve's question. He wants to know how much thought leadership is necessary in Africa versus the solutions that can be localized. So he's interested in the responses from anyone on the panel. How important is thought leadership, or is it all about the product, or is it a balance of both?
I'm going to start with something, and I know Mike has a lot to add to this. Oftentimes, typically, you'll see an African leader hold up a computer or a school principal and think, well, this is the answer. This is really what will bring our country into a globalized world and bring all sorts of education opportunities into our schools. However, the equipment is only a part of the solution, if not ultimately the lowest cost part of the solution. And being technology-driven, equipment-driven in terms of the thinking behind ed tech, as opposed to thinking about the learning objectives we want to achieve, I think that's really an area of thought leadership that's essential. That's essential.
And I would certainly agree with Jim at that. I would maybe a bit of a contrarian maybe perspective is to say that actually from a business perspective, I think we see a lot of thought leadership in the educational technology area, perhaps too much and too little attention to actual practical sound solutions that can be localized for market needs, as Steve mentioned. So I think specifically in the ed tech space, I think there is a need for, in some cases, sort of a less rhetoric and thinking and more actual doing things that are relevant. In many cases, that means low cost, but I think a challenge that a lot of companies face is they equate low cost in Africa with low quality, and the consumers, if you will, there are as discriminating as anywhere else. And so I caution against equating low cost with low quality. There is a very definite need, that said, for thought leadership on these broader educational and developmental challenges. And to the extent that companies can help shape and inform and support those larger I guess, thought leadership opportunities and issues, I think there's real potential there.
And Mike, before I give Charles a chance to respond, I just wondered, can you give any examples of some specific solutions that you felt like were developed and localized well in Africa and that really kicked off well?
Yeah, so that kicked off well, very few that kicked off well. I think what success is about in many places is iterating quickly just like everywhere else, and learning from local context quickly. I mean, I think Jim, the stuff that Jim is doing, I think is a good example of looking at the environment and learning and looking at product and services they're offering as something that will evolve and will be contextualized for the actual environments in which you're working and not just exported from environments that you know very well. So I actually think that's a good, I think that's one good example. Certainly taking into effect that many educational solutions related to technology in other parts of the world have at their core a number of fundamental assumptions, oftentimes increasingly around the cloud and the availability of the cloud, and certainly the availability of electricity. And the digital divide in Africa is as much about access to electricity as anything. And I think that's something that many places learn the hard way because they make assumptions that it's not quite as challenging as it is, and they find out once they're actually selling into these markets that there are different sorts of challenges than they thought, and the ones who can change and adapt most quickly are the ones that are most successful.
Yeah, we had a major challenge with electricity, and we found that when you go from school to school, you see computer labs that basically aren't working, and they're not working because if they're in repair, they're not working typically because the electricity cuts on and off all day long. And obviously that creates a messy situation given how class periods are structured in schools. So our solution had to integrate low power to the extent that it could run on a battery that moves between the classrooms with the interactive whiteboard. And that meant that no existing interactive whiteboard on the marketplace would work, to be honest. We had to adapt. So there is one example, and there are many others where you just learn from doing it.
Thanks for chiming in with those specifics. And Charles, I wanted to make sure to come back to you as well and get your opinion about the balance between thought leadership and the sound solution.
Okay, to the extent that I understand the question, I'm unable to see it, Kelly. But I think, again, it's very easy to generalize it about Africa, but circumstances on the ground, country by country, are very different. And there is absolutely a role for software vendors to play, for example, in thought leadership in most countries in Africa. I think there is also, in many African countries, tremendous skill, ability, knowledge, and thought leadership with respect to ICT and education. And I suspect that a lot of solutions to problems of electrification, to problems of instructional models and that kind of thing are going to be, to one degree or another, solved locally. But I do believe there's a big role for organizations outside to play, and there are plenty of conundrums in Africa. One of the conundrums is, is economies of scale. So, for example, is it realistic for a country of 11 million people in Africa to develop its own ICT-based curriculum for mathematics? And to do it using validated research models and instructional models that have been proven to be effective in not just their environment, but in other environments around the world. The truth is, it's probably not economically feasible to do that in a country that size in terms of the relative investment that would need to be made. And the skill sets really don't exist today. So there's a lot of opportunity, I think, for vendors from the outside to bring in solutions that have been proven effective in other parts of the world and work to deploy those and adapt them to the local requirements over time. But so I'm hedging a little bit on the answer to that question, I guess. I think there's tremendous skill, ability, and thought leadership that is coming from African countries themselves, but I think there's a tremendous opportunity for organizations from outside to play in thought leadership with respect to ICT in education in Africa.
Great. Thanks, Charles. Sorry, I forgot that you couldn't see the question there, but you did a great job answering. So I don't see any other questions coming in from the attendees. Oh, here's one. How much competition will come from local African organizations versus multinational corporations coming into African markets? So I think that's a bit of a response to your statements, Charles. I mean, do you see more competition coming from within Africa or from outside?
Definitely more competition today coming from outside. I'm hopeful that in the long run, that organizations working in Africa can help to develop to not only develop but to transfer the skills locally to begin to do things that enable those countries to participate in the digital economies that they all want to participate in. And so I'm hopeful that competition eventually will start coming from within Africa. I don't know what the time frame on that will be.
And I would say, Kelly, this is Mike, that I do see a lot of competition from multinationals for local African partners. Because in many cases where the markets are really still emerging, I think there is intense competition to figure out who you can partner with, and where there are a limited number of viable candidates, that is something that I think many places find as a challenge. And when we're talking about multinationals, I think we need to be, it's useful to remember that there are multinationals operating out of South Africa specifically that are active all over the continent. That are both sort of are working multinationally, and they're sort of born of the African experience. That's important to note, as well as increasingly from China. And the number of Chinese firms I see coming in to Africa, oftentimes together with Chinese developmental assistance, it's something that isn't remarked on a lot in the press, but on the ground I see it increasingly. I see it a lot. And looking at what some of those companies are doing might be, whether they're as potential partners or rivals or both, that is something also to consider.
Great. Thanks, Mike. And as we talk about this competition and the companies that we see coming into the African market or partnering with others in Africa, and as we talked about some of the obstacles earlier, how can you comment about mobile learning in Africa? I know we said that it plays a large role. Can you provide any more specifics or information around mobile learning?
We've been using mobile learning for teacher professional development very successfully. We've been using traditional SMS messaging. We haven't gotten into browser-based mobile learning just because don't have the market penetration. But teachers and students just are teachers are heavily into texting. In Senegal, it doesn't cost anything to receive an SMS message, for example. So we've had some great luck with the mobile phones in learning, and I think one of the big challenges out there is to integrate the mobile phone more into learning.
And I think this is Mike. I think this is an area where there's tremendous and obvious potential. And I think it gets to this issue. We've been mainly, I think, talking about education markets in the sort of the formal education sector. But there are huge opportunities for growth for informal learning. whether it's on-the-job training or tutoring or supplementary educational services and products, and a lot of those will be offered over the phone. Most people in Africa will get online for the first time and may only get online through their phone or through a phone-like device. We're seeing these low-cost Android tablets out of China starting to come in certain places, and whether it's a phone or some other a little bit larger device, I think that is the form factor that is perhaps most interesting to a lot of people in the near future.
Yeah, and this is Charles. Mobile learning is going to play a significant role in delivering education, particularly to rural populations in Africa. One of the highly generalized differences between South America and Africa is that in South America, 70% of the population roughly is urban, and 30% is rural, whereas just the reverse is true for the most part in Africa. And there are huge underserved rural populations in Africa whose only connection to the digital universe out there is via the mobile carrier. So the carriers who have implemented data networks on their voice networks. Now, mobile learning means a lot more than just using SMS messages and using a mobile phone for learning. There will be a number of other devices, including tablets that Mike mentioned, including different format PC, fully functional PCs that will be easily attached to those networks. And with properly architected software that minimizes the data footprint on the carrier's network, ICT-based educational solutions can be delivered today through the carrier networks at a relatively small price. So I think mobile learning is going to be increasingly a factor in Africa, particularly in serving rural populations.
May I add one very quick thing, Kelly, to that,
Sure.
to what Charles said? Around the world there's a lot of experimentation in mobile learning, and I don't think there are a lot of interesting models and initiatives, but it is something where we know we have lots of questions but not a lot of good answers. And I think there are interesting opportunities for companies. If you can make something work in Africa, it might well be that what you learn there can be translated to making stuff work in other places around the world. There are opportunities, I think, as we saw with mobile banking, where a lot of the rest of the world, mobile banking wasn't really something that took off, whereas in Africa and the Philippines, mobile banking has taken off like gangbusters, especially in places like Kenya. And now the companies involved in that experience, for example, in Kenya, are now able to take that experience and jump back to more developed markets, because what they've learned about working at scale and low cost and meeting certain user needs is actually relevant in other parts of the world.
And to make it work, that you've got to consider what are the devices out there. If you want something to take off this year or next, right? And what is the cost to the end user? So that's easily ignored with all of the bells and whistles associated with browser-based mobile learning. But the phones there in Africa generally are still pretty basic.
Well, I think we're at the top of the hour. We've left 1 minute for Karen to wrap up, but I just want to thank Jim, Mike, and Charles for the great session today. I learned a lot myself, and I'm sure all of our attendees are happy they spent the last hour with you. So thank you.
Yes, and I also want to express my appreciation for everyone, including the participants who spent this time with us and some of the great questions we got from a few of you. Just as a quick feedback, I think that this web conferencing service sends you a quick feedback form, so if you can give us some responses to that, it would be great. Again, my name is Karen Billings, and you can contact me at the email there on the last slide, particularly if you're interested in joining the Global Working Group. I think that next year they have a lot of great things planned. I also want to remind you that if there's any way that you would like to participate in the BET show, for as little as about $500, you can get some presents there and get some leads back. Email me again at kbillings@sia.net. And you'll get information soon about how to download the slides and the listen to the audio again or share that with your colleagues. Thank you for joining. Bye.
Thank you. Please stand by.